Welcome to another session of lectures by LOB-EZ. I'm your host, Dr. LOB-EZ. Thank you for joining me as we sprint down the hall of knowledge. Today's topic is the Russian Revolution. So if we look up the learning objectives, we're going to look at some of the things that gave Russia problems as far as progress goes. We'll go all the way back to the mid-1800s or mid-1850s and look at some of the obstacles that were in their way, their attempts to reform and industrialize, but we're also going to look at some of the authoritarian measures that really caused disaster for the Romanov dynasty that ruled Russia. So one of the terms Bolshevik Revolution is sort of synonymous with the Russian Revolution. So I'll be referring to the revolution by both. And then we'll look to some of the features of communism that existed after the Russian Revolution. Okay. So if we take a look at this map here, we can kind of see just how vast Russia was. And it was a country that throughout its history has been sort of focused on growing, and it is the largest country in the world, and it is sort of unique in that it straddles two continents, both Europe and Asia. The vast majority of the country lies in Asia, but yet its population base and its culture is certainly more European than Asian. So by the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, Russia, as the world's largest country, was technically an empire, meaning that it had a lot of different ethnic groups, and that's going to be sort of part of the problems. One of the problems that Russia runs into is nationalism within its multiple ethnic groups sort of fighting for independence. Okay. So one of the problems, one of the biggest problems that Russia ran into was that it never industrialized as its European neighbors were doing. So it sort of just what seemed sort of satisfied to kind of continue on the path that it had went on for many centuries, and that is that it relied on serfs. And so that means that it was a agriculturally based economy. And we're going to see how that causes lots of problems for them. Okay, the fact that they were unwilling to industrialize. And that's why I mentioned earlier that I was going to sort of talk about the 1850s, because we've already discussed this topic, but we need to address what happens after the Crimean War. And so this was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, but we see France and Great Britain get involved on the side of the Ottoman against the Russians, because the Russians were feared because of how large they were, and France and Great Britain didn't want Russia to upset the balance of power that existed in Europe. And you might recall that Russia's defeat in the Crimean War led to the destruction of the willingness of European countries to kind of work together. Okay, and so, more importantly, though, this represents a turning point in Russia's history, and because it lost the war, it realized that it needed to industrialize, because they had great difficulties during the war in producing weapons, mass producing weapons, and not only that, but transporting those weapons and troops to the front line. So they lacked railroads. All right, and so Tsar Alexander II is super pivotal during this time, because he comes to the throne like in its final year of the Crimean War. And so after the war, he realizes that reform is necessary, and that its country, that the Russian country needed to modernize, industrialize. Okay, so he implements a series of reforms. Okay, and if you notice this is in red, that means it's a key point. It's one of the answers to the questions on the study guide. So one of his most important reforms was that he emancipated the serfs. So what does that mean? It just means that he freed them. So no longer could their nobles require service from them. And this gave them the ability to move around. It allowed them to own property. And even though it didn't work the way in which Alexander thought it would, it does grant them their freedom. All right. He was hoping that it would lead to more modern agricultural implementations, and it didn't really work out that way. At any rate, another one of his reforms was he instituted a form of local government, giving the people a voice on local matters. They were called the zemstvos. He doesn't go too far and allow people to have a say in like the national government, but they do have a voice on the local level, and so he thought that that was an important reform. Another one was that Russians were granted the right to trial by jury as opposed to being tried by their noble lords, and so this created a little bit more political equality. Another one was a military reform, and this was to prevent the soldiers from deserting the military. Prior to his reign, soldiers could be conscripted or drafted into the military for periods of 25 years, which really was sort of like a life sentence. And so he reduced it down to 15, of which only 6 years had to be served actively, and the rest could be served as a reserve. So those are some noteworthy reforms. As far as industrially, he was able to get some foreign investments that helped them begin the process of building some railroads. But unfortunately for him and the reforms, he was assassinated by a group of radical socialists, and this is his carriage being bombed and him dying. His son, his successor, Alexander III, kind of saw what happened to his father, even though his father was a reformer. And so what he does is he sort of backtracks on all of those reforms and implements a very strict authoritarian government. Another word for that would be autocratic. And so he implements a secret police and tamps down, free speech, censors the press, and utilizes political prisoners or political prisons, sending people to Siberia, which is known for its terribly cold winters. So there's a lot of harsh treatment. Okay, so any reforms that Alexander II implements sort of gets reversed under his son, and so that's not going to bode well for Alexander's successor, who will be Nicholas II, who we'll talk about in just a moment. One of the ways in which he attempted to try to tamp down some of the unrest that was caused by nationalism was he implemented a plan known as Russification. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of different ethnic groups that existed in Russia, and so in an attempt to create unity in the country, he prevented people from speaking their native languages, and they had to worship the only religion one religion, and that was Eastern Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. So this was an attempt to try to, as I said, tamp down unrest and unify the people. And one of the groups that gets repressed the worst were the Jews. Part of that had to do with their involvement in the terrorists who assassinated his father. And so he kind of used this as an excuse to repress the Jews and hopefully get many of them to kind of flee the country. So following a economic collapse in the 1880s, um, he promotes this persecution of Jews known as pogroms. So he kind of scapegoats the Jews and encourages the population to seek out the Jews and punish them and kind of blame them for the economic problems that Russia was suffering from. And so this series of attacks against the Jews is incredibly violent, and it leads to over 1 million Jews fleeing Russia. Many of them go to Central Europe, like Austria, Vienna, that was a big place where many of them settled. And then hundreds of thousands eventually make their way to the United States. So I said that he backtracked on a lot of the reforms, which is true, like political freedom and some of the social reforms, but not economically. Alexander III continues the goal of wanting to modernize their economy, because that's going to strengthen ultimately the military and make the Russian Tsar more powerful. So under the guy Sergei Witte, the finance minister for not only him but his son Nicholas II, who will be his successor, we start to see the industrialization of Russia take place. Okay, lots of foreign investment to build factories, to build railroads, to help tap into some of the vast amounts of coal, iron, and even oil that can be found in Russia. And so the crowning achievement, though, of Sergei Witte that really sort of shows that Russia is becoming industrialized was the creation of a Trans-Siberian Railroad. So this is massive, 5,800 miles that traverses all of Russia. So you can see on the map in the western portions of Russia, Moscow, there are several lines that reach all the way to the Pacific in eastern Russia called Vladivostok. So as far as industrialization goes, the creation or the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, again, really symbolizes the growth of industrialization. So Alexander III dies. His successor is his son Nicholas II, and Nicholas II is pretty much just going to follow his father in his father's footsteps and be an autocratic, authoritarian Tsar of Russia. All right, and we're going to see that there's going to be some things that take place that create a revolution and just understand that the unwillingness of the czars to sort of reform are kind of, is what's causing a lot of it. So to sort of keep up with their European neighbors as far as sort of modernizing and becoming more industrialized and becoming more powerful, they feel the need to get involved in imperialism. And, where the other European countries sort of focused on Africa, the Russians are focusing in on Asia. And so they're able to gobble up some territory in Manchuria, as you can see in this map here. And then this leads them to start eyeing parts of Korea. And this is going to put them on a collision course with Japan. And, the Japanese oppose the Russian interference in northern Korea, but the Russians under Nicholas II sort of ignore that, and to their great dismay, the Japanese attack them. And so if we go back a couple units, we remember that the Japanese had modernized the Meiji Restoration. And we've already talked about how in the past how they have become an industrialized country. And so what results is the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and the Russians, even though they have the Trans-Siberian Railroad, they can't match the modern military that the Japanese have, and so this is a humiliating defeat for Russia, and it just sort of triggers a lot of unrest at home, and people are very angry. all sorts of different groups, okay? And so people begin to sort of protest the poor working conditions in the cities. There's ethnic groups that are protesting. There's even people who we would call liberals who want a more representative government. And so they all sort of converge in 1905 with what is known as Bloody Sunday. Okay, and so 200,000 protesters are organized by this Orthodox priest, and they march on the Winter Palace, which is the home of the Tsar, and Nicholas II is spooked and he flees, but it's a peaceful protest. But he leaves instructions for his soldiers that are protecting the palace to disperse the crowd, and so they begin firing into the crowd and shooting up to 1,000 of the civilians. And again, this is a peaceful protest. It's not armed rioters or anything like that. But when news of this breaks, it triggers violent protests and strikes all over the country, mainly in the more industrialized cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. And so this is what is known as the Revolution of 1905, and there's fear that this will spiral out of control. And so it leads Nicholas to introduce a reform. And this is what a lot of the liberals had wanted. They had wanted a representative form of government, okay? And so he agrees to the creation of something known as a Duma, which is just a legislative body. We have one in the United States. It's called Congress. Great Britain has one. It's known as the Parliament. And so they were elected by universal suffrage, but they want a new constitution, and they basically want to follow the path that Great Britain had, and that is the creation of a constitutional monarchy or a limited monarchy where the power of the Tsar is not absolute, that he has to share power with the Duma or the legislative body. So he doesn't want to do that, and so he sort of balks and dismisses the Duma and just attempts to sort of restore order after things have kind of calmed down. And this is not going to be successful because he doesn't address the underlying, cause of the revolution, and that is just that the need for reform. So things are going to go from bad to worse when Russia enters World War I. So it's been, roughly 10 years since their defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, and the Russians sort of feel that they're ready to fight, take on the Germans and the Austrians, and we know how that works out. It's a huge disaster. They suffer millions of casualties, even just in the first year of fighting by the Germans, and whatever problems that they had in the Crimean War and in the Russo-Japanese War just amplified in World War I because of it. It's such a large conflict. And so one of the things that Tsar Nicholas does in an attempt to sort of improve their luck, kind of turn the tide in their favor, is he moves to the front lines and he takes direct charge of the army away from his generals, thinking that this is going to boost morale for his for the men, for the army. But it proves to be a big mistake because he does not have the military knowledge to do so. And probably worse than that is he leaves his wife in charge, and that's not necessarily the issue. It's who she sort of is being influenced by. And so a little back history. They have 5 children, Nicholas and his wife, Alexandra, and their youngest child is a boy, and his name is Alexei or Alexis. well, he's known by Alexei. I guess his name is Alexander. But he, as the heir to the throne, they keep it secret that he's got this disease. It's a blood disorder called hemophilia, which they didn't have any treatment for back then, and it causes internal bleeding, and basically the blood does not clot. Anyway, they didn't want anyone to know that the heir to the throne was, could potentially die at any moment, that could cause, problems with a crisis of secession, if that makes sense. At any rate, they had quietly tried to treat this, but with no success. And this faith healer, sort of religious man, is able to gain an audience with the royal family. His name is Rasputin. That's who's pictured there to the right. And for whatever reason, he has the ability to sort of calm the outbursts of hemophilia in their son, and so they keep him around. Well, this guy is what we would classify as a charlatan. He's a bad dude, and he's got a drinking problem, and he sort of uses his position with, or his favored position with the royal family to have a lot of affairs with women, and so his exploits are well known, and it starts getting picked up by the newspapers, and eventually there are rumors that he's having an affair with the Tsarina, and so basically he's assassinated by members of the sort of royal family, and the damage is done, though. It just shows that the royal family is, lacking leadership skills, and ultimately that's going to sort of seal the fate for them. So as the war is going worse and worse for Russia in late 1917, they're eventually, Nicholas II is convinced that he should just step down, abdicate his throne, and that's what he does, okay? And so there is what we call a provisional government. And this provisional government is basically going to try to create a republic. The president is the man pictured here. His name is Alexander Kerensky. And so they're writing a new constitution. But one of the things that he does, which historians look back at and say this is a big mistake, was that they continued fighting World War I. That they should have sought some type of peace terms with Germany because of just how bad the losses were for Russia. So the provisional government wasn't very stable yet. It hadn't gotten its feet under it, and it's having to fight this terribly deadly war while trying to create a new constitution. All right, so this is where this guy Vladimir Lenin enters in, and he is very important because he is a revolutionary. He's a socialist. He is a follower of Karl Marx, and he has a group of followers known as Bolsheviks, and basically they want to radically or violently overthrow the government and replace it with communism. Or the goal, first socialism, and then with the hope of creating a communist state after that. Because he's a revolutionary, he gets arrested several times. He gets put in prison. He gets sent to Siberia, but ultimately he's just kicked out of the country. And so he sets up shop in Switzerland. And he's there with some of his followers, and they continue to write newspapers that get smuggled into Russia. So he has a small following there. Well, the Germans catch wind of who he is, and they see this as like an opportunity to sort of maybe knock Russia out of the war. So that they meet with him, and they agree to take transport he and some of his fellow Bolsheviks into Russia with the idea that they would cause an internal revolution, and then after and if they're successful, afterwards they would pull Russia out of the war. So that's sort of the agreement. And so the Germans send he and his Bolsheviks by train all the way to just outside of St. Petersburg, and they make their way back into Russia. And so they begin sort of infecting Russian factories and cities, agitating workers, trying to foment revolution. They had several slogans, peace, land, and bread, that, they wanted to end the war. They were making promises that if they were given power, then all the farmers, all the peasants in Russia would gain land, and of course the industrial workers wouldn't have to deal with all the food shortages, and they would receive bread and money and things like that. So they were able to stage a coup, or an overthrow of the provisional government, in November 1917. That's known as the Bolshevik Revolution. So they overthrow the government, and then they establish a new flag, and will become the flag of the Soviet Union. But what we see here is the union of the hammer and the sickle. So this symbolizes the workers. The sickle symbolizes the coming together of the workers and the farmers. So the Bolshevik Revolution, though, is not without its enemies. And so on top of the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia has to deal with a civil war. So all those forces that don't want to see socialist or radical communists have control of Russia, they're going to rise up, they're going to join forces, and there's a period of civil war after Russia pulls out of World War I. Okay, and one of the reasons was because they do pull out of World War I. Lenin makes this peace agreement with the Germans known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and in it they lose all of this territory to Germany. All right, it's going to be very short-lived because Germany is ultimately going to lose the war, but the Russians don't know that, and so that's really what triggers the Civil War. All right, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and how much land Russia had to give away to Germany as a result of that. So that triggers the Russian Civil War, and there's two sides. The Reds, those are the communists led by the Bolsheviks, and then you have the White Army, and those are basically everyone who opposes this new radical form of government. And interestingly enough, they get support from the Allies like Great Britain, France, even the United States. They're trying to help the whites regain control of the country. One of the things that happens is the Bolsheviks find the royal family. They have them executed so that they couldn't ever come back to power. And they implement a secret police known as the Cheka, and they go out and they begin assassinating and eliminating all those people who might stand against them. And so this is one of the ways in which Lenin is able to consolidate power. He puts one of his trusted associates, Leon Trotsky, in charge of the Red Army, and he's able to sort of whip them into shape with some pretty harsh measures. And ultimately, the Red Army is able to defeat the whites, and the Bolsheviks are able to assume total control of the country. All right. And they take over all the factories, they take over all the businesses, they seize all property, and they don't deliver the land that they had promised to the peasants. And in fact, they begin taking their crops away from them to sort of feed the soldiers who were fighting during the Civil War. Anyway. They create a new country. It's known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, known as the Soviet Union. It's established in 1922. And it on paper, it looks like a republic with all of these different, what we would call provinces or states. They call them Soviets, but in actuality, it's a dictatorship, and it's led by the Communist Party. All right, and the people of Russia are going to realize that they're going to have no freedoms, absolutely zero, under this new regime. All right, but the problem is the seizing of all private property and all the factories and all the businesses leads to economic collapse. And for this to be successful, they need to get their economy up and running. And so, ironically enough, Lenin introduces what is known as the new economic policy. And essentially what the new economic policy is they go back and they adopt capitalistic ideas, such as ownership of private property, the profit motive, giving people the opportunity, or I guess the incentive to work hard. And so the new economic policy helps the Soviet Union sort of get back on its feet economically. But for Lenin, it's too little too late, because he dies shortly thereafter. And so this creates sort of a power struggle for who's going to succeed. Lenin, he has a stroke, and he hasn't named who his successor would be, but there's two men that sort of emerge as the possibilities. One is this guy, Leon Trotsky. He was sort of Lenin's closest, advisors. And then there's this guy, Joseph Stalin, who was sort of the secretary of the Communist Party. Anyway, they're going to kind of duke it out for control, and eventually Stalin's going to win. And Trotsky flees the Soviet Union, ends up in Mexico, and Stalin sends some of his secret police members down there to assassinate him. And he is going to be the dictator, if you will, of the Soviet Union. They call him the premier, until his own death in 1953. And so we'll be talking about him in another video. But that's it for the Russian Revolution. Thanks for watching.